Good afternoon. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Sekou Franklin, and I'm a professor of political science at Middle Tennessee State University. And today we're going to talk about the Black Rural Project, the Black Rural Study that was initially launched by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. A couple of our panelists, unfortunately, are out due to emergencies. So I think Dara and I will try to do the best that we can to extend that time all the way through an hour, hopefully speaking. My name is, again, Sekou Franklin, and I'm going to both chair and moderate this session, as well as talk about at least one part of the study, which deals with the Alabama Black Belt. But let me just see if I can tell you a little bit about this study for those of you who are joining us today, and who also will be viewing this on YouTube. In 2019, as president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, I announced the potential idea of having a focus on Black rural communities, which ultimately became the Black Rural Project. And the emphasis behind this, at least from my standpoint, not being a person I'm not from a rural community, but the emphasis behind this was really shaped in part by, at the time, the 2018 midterm elections, the 2016 presidential elections, and also my experience also in Tennessee, in which Dara Gaines maybe has researched this more than I have. Princess Williams, who was also supposed to join us, also has, I think, looked at this as well. The idea that rural is often a code word for white conservatism and white working class conservatism. And that concept of rural does not match the reality in which rural communities are more diverse, especially in the South and also the Midwest, but we're focusing primarily on the South. That rural communities are more diverse. There's a significant amount of Black folks who make up rural communities. Also the emphasis behind this was that also within the rural landscape, there's more diversity that exists. There's kind of post-industrial smaller cities that are still rural, but also much larger than, say, for example, those cities that have fewer people. And there's also a new and emerging non-white population emerging in rural communities, or non-native born population emerging in rural communities. It's often overlooked. And there I want to also reference, just as a footnote, the new book by Dorian Brown Crosby, or Dorian Crosby Brown. I always get that mixed up. So our idea was to really champion a Black rural project with the idea of possibly reshaping and also defining this idea of what's called who is rural, what is rural, and positioning African Americans at the forefront of this conversation, with the hope, and we didn't get there, but with the hope that this could ignite maybe a national conversation, perhaps taken on by African American elected officials and others, to also focus attention on redefining what is rural and making that part of a national conversation, a national discussion. So today we have two reports from that Black Rural Project. We have a report that I'm going to give on the Alabama Black Belt, and then we also have a report, I believe, on the Arkansas Delta, and we have Dara Gaines, who's from Northwestern University, correct? Am I right about Northwestern University? But also, I think the work that Dara is doing, and also the work that Princess Williams is doing, collectively, their two works, I think, are going to be groundbreaking examinations of Blacks in rural communities. I think that really no one else is doing. So I'll give a shout out to that. I guess what we'll do is, Dara, are you okay if I give my presentation first and then you can give your presentation?
Yep,
okay.
That's fine with me.
Or do you want to go the other way? Okay, wait. And like I said, for those of you who are just joining us, two of our presenters, unfortunately, are not here because of an emergency. We were trying to get a pre-recorded video from Princess Williams, and she did offer possibly recording a video and sending it to anyone who might be interested after this presentation. So let's get started if we can. Okay, I'm going to pull up slides. Can everyone see that right there? Okay,
Yes.
you can see it. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, I want to thank the conference program co-chairs for organizing an excellent conference. As mentioned earlier, the Black Rural Project was part of an initiative carried out by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists to try to look at rural communities, but also to try to make the argument that we need to define what and who is rural, and position African Americans into that conversation, or at least at the forefront of that conversation. From the standpoint of where I sit, as president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in my 2 years, I was able to form a partnership with the Black Belt Community Foundation and also the Selma Center for Nonviolent Truth and Reconciliation to conduct a study of the Alabama Black Belt, particularly of Selma, Dallas County. And the study took about 1.5 years to conduct. I'm going to talk about what the study is, what the study entailed. It's not really an intensely academic study. It's much more of a study of community engagement. But I'm going to walk through the study and why it's important, I think, for us. And the study was funded by a large grant that came through the Black Belt Community Foundation and the Selma Center for Nonviolent Truth and Reconciliation. The grant was the Kellogg Foundation Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Grant, and ultimately it was also produced as a white paper that was submitted to all the participating groups that you see right there. And NCOPS was also a partner in that study, and we were fortunate enough to get a mention in the submission of the proposal to Kellogg. So the co-sponsors of the study were the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, as mentioned earlier, Selma Center for Nonviolent Truth and Reconciliation, Black Belt Community Foundation, also ETR Services, which is led by Corey Robertson, who's out of North Carolina, a group that I work with called Democracy Nashville, allowed us to use one of their organizers to assist with some note-taking in other areas. And then the overall project was funded by the Kellogg Foundation's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Project in Selma. So, and the idea behind this study and our conversations with the advocates in Selma was that, and part of this study was developed because of some previous relationships with some advocates in Selma that I was fortunate enough to have from going back some number of years, was to have a community engaged research project. And so just kind of, if you're kind of, for those people in the academy, the report that we wrote is not sophisticated quantitatively, but that was per the request of the advocates on the ground. They wanted something that just entailed crosstabs and focus groups and stuff like that. So the idea was to have a community engaged research with advocates on the ground guiding the research questions. We wanted to reinterpret rural identity, as mentioned earlier. We wanted to position Blacks at the center of rural identity, but also recognize the diversity within Black rural communities. So as an example, the Alabama Black Belt, Selma it's a small city or small town, but relative to the other Alabama Black Belt counties, such as Lowndes County, Perry County, Wilcox County, other counties in there, Selma is considered to be the hub or the larger county there. So recognizing the diversity within Selma, within the Alabama Black Belt, and also seeing if we could shape advocacy outcomes. And the idea behind a conversation with advocates on the ground in Selma in particular, who were leading this project, was that we could, ambitiously speaking, we could kind of recreate a modern variation of the Lowndes County study that Du Bois worked on. And so some of you may know this, but when Du Bois had two major local studies, the Philadelphia Negro, and he did a study in Virginia. I think it was in, correct me if I'm wrong, Farmville, Virginia. The third variation of that was funded by the federal government was a study in the Alabama Black Belt with Lowndes County, which Du Bois said was his major flagship study. That is, it was his dream study, his best study. And the study got lost. Du Bois thinks the study was destroyed, but it entailed a survey of at least 1,000 Black rural residents. And had it been published, it would have, and that's a letter that he's writing to his friend about the study. or commissioner from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Had it been published, Du Bois thinks it would have been his best study, better than the Philadelphia Negro, better than some of the other studies. So the folks in Alabama that we worked with were very aware of this study and wanted to kind of move towards recreating a focus on Alabama Black Belt in the tradition of Du Bois. So the methodology for the study was to have what's called 4 intake sessions. We call them intake sessions. In academia, they would be a combination of what's called focus group sessions and participatory observation. We did 3 of them in Selma, and 1 in the housing project in Selma, and then we did 1 in Uniontown, Alabama. And Uniontown, Alabama is right next to, is in a town called Perry County, which is right next to Dallas County. And Uniontown, Alabama has probably, in the last decade or so, the most important environmental justice fight probably in Alabama, in which Uniontown, Alabama is a target of a corporate landfill that's receiving waste from 30+ states, as well as coal ash. And so that fight in Uniontown, Alabama has brought in Cory Booker, Human Rights Watch, and other kinds of folks in terms of focusing attention on that part of Alabama, Uniontown, Alabama. And then you have, and I won't take too much time on this, but one thing about Selma, as I see it as an academic, others may differ, is that when we talk about Selma and Bloody Sunday and the movie Selma, it actually wasn't just a Selma movement. Actually, it was, from where I stand, it's probably a Selma, Perry County movement. And Uniontown is one town in Perry County. Marion is another town in Perry County. But even the way that we talk about the Selma, half the protests were taking place in Perry County. So it involved the participants in the survey, the participants in the focus groups and intake sections actually co-produced the questions. We were able to fortunately bring in Camille Burge out of Villanova University as one of the principal investigators. Princess Williams was our other principal investigators. So they participated in 2 of the 4 intake sessions that we had. Okay. And then through Camille, Princess, and other folks, we were able to develop a 500-person a survey to target 500 people, 43 question survey, in which most of the questions were developed by the advocates on the ground. We also included a section in the survey that dealt specifically with the truth, racial healing, and transformation programs that were being funded in Selma. And that's pretty much, that was the kind of linkage in terms of how we got the funding, that we would also do a survey of the programs that served as kind of a quasi-evaluation of the programs that were being conducted there. So that's just kind of a picture of some of our visitations there. You can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, that's Camille Burge and that's Princess Williams, meeting with some advocates. That's us on the top left-hand side of the screen. That's myself and some other folks meeting in a housing project in Selma. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, that's us in Uniontown, Alabama, which is a very, very poor town where the landfill is a major source of controversy. And this process took place between December 2019 and March of 2020, right before the shutdown of COVID-19. So let's just look a little bit at the Alabama Black Belt. This area that has entrenched poverty, particularly in Selma, Dallas County, that some research has said is very uncommon in the first world. It's considered to be one of the top 10 highest poverty counties in the country. Next to Dallas County, you see that there's Perry County as well, where you got that environmental justice fight, and then you have Lowndes County as well on the other side, where Stokely Carmichael and others gained their claim to fame in terms of organizing there in 1965 and 66. That's experienced a sanitation-induced hookworm in recent years that has caused major health challenges. So I'm making this point because Alabama Black Belt is seen as largely an area that has significant public health epidemics that are at a high level. But it also has a history, it also has an important history, rich history. On one side, you have Tuskegee University, you have other smaller HBCUs and community colleges, you have a history of social activism that involves young people dating back not just to the 1960s, but also continuing up until the 1990s and late 1980s. And then you have a major push in in Alabama, and also in other parts of the South, from North Carolina to Georgia, rural communities, Black rural communities, on what's called an heirs property fight. That is people whose family owned property going back to the early 20th century that is now being gobbled up by developers and real estate investment trusts. And so there's a big push for property heirs, which I think is deserving of another major research study by some political scientists in terms of what that entails. So let's just look at some of the results of the survey. And the survey was twofold. Really, the survey that we did was trying to not just look at racial divisions that existed in the Alabama Black Belt, but also looking at are there areas of commonality between Blacks and whites, especially given that there's an echo chamber in which one suggests that the racial divisions are intractable in the Alabama Black Belt. So I'll just kind of pull out some ingredients of the study. Most of the results that we have, if you're in political science, there's nothing new. It's not groundbreaking, but if you're organizing in the streets in Alabama Black Belt, if you're involved in organizing and activism, and you don't get hold of survey data, then this information was very important. So one of the things that we found out in terms of commonality was that there was very little trust among both Blacks and whites in local officials. And again, that's nothing groundbreaking for those of us in political science, but for those people in Selma who are working on this racial healing project, what that meant for them was maybe there's ways in which Blacks and whites could engage in kind of good government organizing in order to address these particular issues. So again, I won't go into all of these results, but I just want to kind of highlight the thinking behind the Selma folks and the idea that this was a community engaged project. So we were really kind of following the lead of those advocates and organizers on the ground. This is another slide in which we find again that both Blacks and whites, particularly Blacks, but even among whites, they feel that they're not as included in local government decision-making process. Again, that sentiment is greater among African Americans, but also we see, or the idea that one does not feel included, we find that sentiment to be greater among African Americans. We also find that also to be somewhat significant among whites. In other words, both feel that they do not have as much input on local government decision-making processes. And then again, for those Selma folks, that meant, again, maybe there's ways in which they can organize cross-racial coalitions around good government issues. Again, I won't go into all the data, but I will just talk about some of this information. Race relations and polarization, we find that, again, we find results that are not surprising. There's significant racial polarization in the Alabama Black Belt between Blacks and whites around race relations, treatment of Blacks on their jobs, treatment of Blacks by police, treatment of Blacks in the court system, treatment of Blacks in the school systems, treatment of Blacks when it comes to voting, treatment of Blacks when it comes to shopping, and treatment of Blacks in healthcare. That means that there's a big significant racial divide in how Blacks and whites see the treatment of Blacks in those areas. Another set of results that the Selma, Alabama Black Belt folks wanted to know about support for a variety of different programs. And we see right here that on the bottom hand side, on the bottom part of the screen, we see that question about living wage for municipal employees, not living wage for the private sector, but for municipal employees. We see that there's far greater interest in this among African Americans than there are whites. But we even see that on this issue, whites in this particular area, there was some support for this. There was higher support for a living wage for municipal employees than we thought. And so again, those advocates on the ground were quite intrigued about the fact that even though it's like, 47, 46%, 48% of whites who support a municipal living wage, it was much higher, far much higher than they expected. And so for them, that means that there's some possible organizing that they can engage in that particular arena. And then this looks at race and COVID-19 data right here. We find that Blacks and whites are quite similar when it comes to the racial dimensions of COVID-19. Are they a result of life choices of African Americans? But then when we look at other factors such as there's a COVID-19 epidemic, is it impacting African Americans because of their work in high risk industries, having less adequate health care, the neglect by government leaders, not having testing provisions, we find that the racial divide does exist between Blacks and whites when it comes to COVID-19 infections among African Americans. And then again, a racial divide exists when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on personal financial situations. Again, the reason why we asked COVID-19 questions was because that area of Alabama, particularly from Montgomery all the way down to Selma, was one of the highest infected rates in the country. And then Black Lives Matter, not surprisingly, we found that there was a racial divide that existed between Blacks and whites in both Selma, but also in the broader Alabama Black Belt. And the effectiveness of the Black Lives Matter movement. Not surprising for political scientists. Crime and punishment prevention, we find that African Americans are more likely to support crime prevention measures versus punishment, crime prevention measures, whereas whites are more likely to support punishment. But we find that there's some similarities, that some whites do support prevention measures, and then whites are more likely to support prevention measures if they're attached to punishment. Again, root causes of violence in Selma. Selma has one of the top 10 highest gun violence rates in the country, so they wanted us to ask these questions. And there's some stereotypes right here about why violence exists, particularly among African Americans. And some would say, and we find that whites are more likely to say laziness. Blacks are more likely to say that poverty is a driving force behind gun violence. And then this right here slide just describes those TRHT, those Kellogg Foundation Truth to Racial Healing programs that are being funded in Selma, and whether or not Blacks and whites are using these programs at the highest rate. And so there's nothing really here to make use of unless you're in Selma and you're working in these grassroots programs. But this is just a slide that describes some of the tasks that we had in terms of including in the survey, measurements to include in the survey. So what were some recommendations in talking with the Selma folks that perhaps could be also useful for INCOPEs in the future? And so one is that Blacks and whites, there's a racial divide that exists in Alabama Black Belt, the South, no doubt about it. That seems to be intransigent, intractable, and is part of or intersects with polarization. But on good government concerns, on good government issues, there perhaps is a way to bridge Blacks and whites there in terms of pushing for and advocating for good government programs. At the municipal level, local level, county governments, that Blacks and whites, Blacks are definitely much more supportive of municipal living wage policies, but there is a group of whites, 40 to 50% of whites, who may be open to supporting municipal living wage policies, but not living wage policies for the private sector. Similarly speaking, that Blacks, again, are much more supportive of preventative programs when it comes to crime mitigation, but there was some give and take among whites in that particular arena. So for the Selma folks and this idea of so-called racial healing, then these are kind of areas where they're looking at in terms of possible ways to bridge the divide. And then we argued that there should be a public demand for addressing these issues in Black rural communities. Our ideal scenario would be to have congressional hearings in the Alabama Black Belt, the Mississippi Delta, the Georgia Black Belt, and on and on and on, that really focuses attention on Black folks who are in rural communities, and also even looking at a regional commission that's similar to what we find with the Appalachia Regional Commission, that identifies distressed communities that can receive federal funds. So these are some of the things that we looked at in terms of the Black Road Project in Alabama. Again, it was funded by the Black Belt Community Foundation and their alliances. So, and the questions were primarily driven by advocates and organizers on the ground. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Franklin. So I'll pick it up with talking about Arkansas. So hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today to talk about a people and a place that are near and dear to my heart. I wrote a policy white paper at the behest of Dr. Franklin on the Delta region of Arkansas, and I'd like to share some of my findings with you all today. So I used the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, the Census, and the USDA Economic Research data to compare counties and census tracts on a variety of factors such as racial density, educational status, level of concentrated poverty, and overall community vulnerability. I'll end my discussion by highlighting some areas of concern and implications for economic and political success and next steps for research. So I'll begin with the regional overview. Arkansas is a rural state, and the Delta region is the epitome of that term. Of the 12 counties considered Delta counties, only one is considered urban by the University of Arkansas Extension Service and 2 by the USDA. The average minority population by county is about 42.8%, which exceeds the state's average by about 12 percentage points. And over half of the counties have over 35% Black populations in the county. These statistics demonstrate that any issue that adversely affects Black people will be especially damaging in this region. Regarding the socioeconomic demography, the one urban county is approximately 2.7 times as large as the second largest Delta county, and is 16.5 times as large as Monroe County, which is the most sparsely populated county. The one urban county is home to the only university in the area, with some smaller community colleges interspersed around. Population loss is a significant factor in these Delta counties. Each, except for Craighead, which was the one urban county, experienced population loss, which has serious implications for the strength of the economy and success of public education endeavors. The average percentage of adults 25 years and older, in the Arkansas Delta without a high school diploma is about 19%, which is about 5.7 percentage points higher than the state's average. Each rural county has a rate above the mean, and almost half of this region's census tracts have at least 1 in 5 adults over 25 who do not have a high school diploma. The economy in the Delta has changed from being agricultural with small farms and sharecroppers who are scraping by, to now corporations who are gouging the land and stagnated communities who are trying to rebuild after years of neglect and corruption. The regional unemployment rate is about 1.5 times the statewide unemployment rate, and the regional poverty rate of 8.32% exceeds the state's poverty rate by about 7 percentage points. These 2 points denote the stark contrast between the economic welfare of the state and of the region. A county is classified by the ERS as persistent poverty if more than 20% of its residents were considered poor, as measured by the 1980, 1990, and 2000 census and American Community Survey. 2/3 of the researched Delta communities are considered persistent poverty communities. The Social Vulnerability Index by the CDC flags tracts in the top 10% of values to indicate high vulnerability. There are 83 census tracts in the Arkansas Delta. Of the 83, 18 are flagged for poverty, 17 are flagged for high employment, and 17 are flagged for populations lacking a high school diploma. Important to note, these data show disparate opportunities by county, but also within counties. Counties are governed by single-member districts with an elected county judge and elected quorum court. There are mandated responsibilities and non-mandated responsibilities, which include providing transportation services, upkeep on county roads and bridges, agricultural services, community and rural development, emergency services, waste removal, utility services, and job training. Much of the funds from the American Rescue Plan go to the county, which then determines how those funds are spent. It's no surprise that the vulnerable census tracts are the last to see the money, if they see it at all. With Arkansas in particular, we're currently fighting blatant racial gerrymandering, as many longtime Democratic stronghold House districts have become unfairly competitive and unwinnable in a lot of cases. In conclusion, these data are significant for many reasons, but one of the most important is the quality of life for the residents of the Arkansas Delta. I would also like to point out that just because people don't live in the Delta doesn't mean they aren't affected by similar issues around the state. As Arkansas is almost a completely rural state, Black folks here have similar stories of doing their best to survive and thrive in a place that either acts like they don't exist or treats them as an issue. The variables evaluated here are critical for the advancement or inhibition of social progress. Political participation is important for Arkansans, especially in local and county races where the fate of the county government that rules on economic and social improvement decisions is decided. Unfortunately, Arkansas also ranks dead last in voter registration, with the lowest rates occurring in these areas. So what can we as academics and political professionals do to help? We can get out here and use our skills. I'm currently working on a campaign for a Black man, Chris Jones, who's running for governor of our state. And in our meetings and in our platform, we critically evaluate our actions to make sure and make it clear that we need everyone's vote, not just the folks in the city, not just the white folks with money or the Black folks with money. We need everyone. So we're really engaged in voter registration in majority Hispanic communities and made it a part of our platform to raise the voter registration rate in the Delta area and across the state in general. We cannot allow negative forces to take the vote away from us as they're working to do all over the country. Our community needs our help, and I'm so happy that this project is one way that we're working to give back. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to discussing these results.
Thank you, Dara. Before moving on to the questions, can I pull up I pulled some slides from your presentation, from your report. Can I pull that just so people,
Sure.
so the audience were, so the Arkansas Delta, I believe, am I right there? Is that a good depiction of it right there?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. And then I think just in terms of some of the results right here, you could find that this is kind of just a demographic portrait of the Arkansas Delta, and then there's some other kinds of results as well. Yeah. Okay. And both reports are posted at the NCOPE's website. Last I checked, I'll double check that again. If anyone's interested in the results of those reports, then please, by all means, if you can't get a hold of them, email us. And at least for the Alabama project that we worked on, it did get some publicity. The Montgomery Advertiser did a report or did a story on the Alabama project, as did the Selma Sun and other smaller news organizations. Okay. Okay, so we have about 25 minutes available for a good discussion, question and answer. Like I stated earlier, a couple of our panelists were not able to make it because of emergencies. I'll open it up with the one question to Dara because this is her expertise, and then I'll allow others to ask questions. So you're probably one of the, like I said, I think, and I'm not maybe as, I don't maybe have a good grasp on what everyone is studying, but I think you and Princess Williams, but particularly you're probably the only two people focusing on what Black rural identity or Black rural political behavior. What are some of the challenges to surveying and polling these communities? Because particularly in Alabama, I found some challenges. I'm doing another project right now for the audience in Georgia on poultry workers, particularly, and they're primarily in rural Georgia. And there are some challenges with surveying these communities. So can you talk about that?
Of course. So you're right. There are certainly plenty of challenges with getting in touch with these communities. And I think the largest challenge for surveying them is just access, right? So one big thing that people are talking about in Arkansas right now is broadband. They've been laying down these fiber optic cables for years, trying to get broadband everywhere, and apparently it's about to come online. But as we well know, that doesn't necessarily mean that our communities are going to be the ones that are having access to the internet. So a lot of times as political scientists, we use these large firms to send out these surveys, and hopefully we have people, that sign up for MTurk and stuff or YouGov, and they take surveys anyway. And so we can just pay them to do that. But in a lot of these places, people aren't spending time on their desktop taking surveys because the internet is too slow. You would be sitting there all day trying to do stuff like that. So I've had to come up with different ways to get this sort of data. So one thing that I'm working on now is building out a network of rural leaders, so community leaders, or just, people in communities that are excited about this sort of work. and I'm going to send out, whatever survey I have to them, and sort of with the snowball method, just ask them to share that with somebody else, because at this point, it's kind of what you have to do. We're kind of coming from the ground up, because even in larger surveys like the ANES, there's some representation, but honestly not enough to really, do what we want to do and say what we want to say. So that's really been the biggest thing, is just finding people who know other people.
And if you're surveying a Selma or a Clarksdale or Helena, it's different than if you're surveying, even though they're so-called rural communities, it's different than if you're distributing that survey in an area that's much smaller.
Right.
That's what we're also finding out. I was told in some of the research that during this trip, we didn't include this group in the survey. I don't think, yes, but I took a trip down to Camden, Alabama, which, for those of you familiar with the Black women quilt makers who made Michelle Obama quilt, that's where they're from. That town was so small that I was told that a survey couldn't even be distributed there. You had to talk to the local minister, try to do a convenience survey or something along those lines. So there were some definite challenges. There's a group that for the Alabama Black Belt Project, we did contract out with New South Research, which is kind of one of the go-to groups that has a panel of participants, but even New South Research can get to some rural communities, but not all rural communities.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's a place where your personal connections really matter. And the more people that you already know, or the people that you know who know somebody else, that really can either make or break the survey.
Thank you. Before opening up the questions, I do want to make this one point too, that that was not discussed in what needs to be discussed in Black in these studies of Black rural communities or small town communities, is there has been a history of Black folks, particularly, being front and center of labor union fights, or the fights for unionization. And Selma is an example of that. Selma wasn't just about a voting rights struggle, but it was also a struggle in which you found a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for example, trying to work with and assist around unionization fights. So I do want to make sure I point that out. We have one question that's in the chat room, and I want to ask you your opinion of this there. What qualifies a town for being declared rural and Black?
Okay.
And then we have one question by Jessica afterwards. Yes.
So that's a good question, and that's something I'm still working through. Honestly, for this report that I made, I used the USDA's certification of rural versus urban, and the ERS economic research data to determine rural versus non-rural. And a lot of that is based on, population numbers and what sort of like factories or how the land use of the place. But something that I'm discovering in my research is that a place isn't necessarily one certain sort of place, right? I can be from a place and feel like I'm a rural girl, I'm country, blah, 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 but another person might not feel that way. So I personally think it's kind of subjective to who you're talking to and what you're talking to them about.
Yeah. So I found the same thing. I know there's some kind of data sources, the social vulnerability index, I think, that we used in some of the research. And other kind of census data that defines, or at least points you in the direction of what is rural. So that concept can be a little bit ambiguous. And then within so-called rural or Black Belt regions, there's intra or internal divisions, or at least internal differences that exist. And just one example, just in the Alabama Black Belt that I studied, Selma is considered to be a post-industrial small city, or or a rural community, but it's really a small city of 18,000 or about 15, 18,000 people. But then when you go outside of Selma, then you really have less populated, what we call traditional rural communities. But then within that region of a 45-mile drive within Selma, you have hierarchies that exist. So if a town controls, for example, the gas companies that delivers gas to other towns, or electricity grids, there's hierarchies that develop. And so even if you have rural communities that have the same amount of population, then one rural community one town has more advantages than the other towns. And so that was also some things that came up as well. We do have a question from Dr. Jessica Lynn Stewart.
Yes, hi everyone. I love this work. I love this group of scholars. I'm such a fan. So I'm just, I have 5 questions, but I'll narrow them down. I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, my child is eating cereal while I'm in a conference. Thank you. So the first question is, and you all can just write them all down and then see. I know when Sekou was talking about Alabama, and you talked about this support for a living wage for municipal workers versus private sector workers. I was curious if you have any information about how many Blacks are working in city jobs versus how many whites, and if you feel like that has any type of bearing on that finding about the support for city job living wage. The other thing, when you talked about, Dara talked about Black folks leaving the kind of an exodus out of the rural, I wasn't sure if it was purely economic or if it was due to some type of being done with racial tension. I didn't hear a lot about racial tension in the presentation. So even just for both states, curious about what the degree of, because I think you can have these differences on paper, but does it feel like that divide is there on the ground? Does it feel tense racially? Or are these kind of things that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you were kind of looking at these survey responses? And then the last one is you showed the infographic that I guess I was just curious. I'm not sure. I think the other organizations put that together with kind of a summary of statistics. I was curious how effective you thought that was, sharing the information in that way to those communities, what type of impact that has. And if you've thought about other ways, going back to kind of Dara's conversation about you have to think creatively because of the population, what are the best ways to share this type of groundwork research with the people who it is really about, and it's just amazing. I'll stop there.
Dara, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I can speak to the second and third points that you raised, Dr. Stewart. Thank you so much for that and your encouragement. I love you so much. Okay. So in this white paper, I didn't really touch on the racial tensions, but in my personal work, I've been talking to people and asking them, what do you think? Do you feel like racial, the way that people get together, has it changed over the past 20, 30, 40 years? Or what do you think now? And for a lot of people, it's been that, they haven't really changed much. It's people know where they're supposed to be, right? So where Black people live in your town, and where white people live in your town. And as long as y'all stay where you're supposed to be, quote unquote, there's not really that many issues. And with that, I feel like this is something I'm still looking into. So we'll see how it goes. But I feel like that also has implications for how people in those areas view outside racial unrest and that sort of stuff. Because if you live in a place where now that you know the rules, right, you can get along by the rules and there's not really that much other stuff going on, then you don't really have a backdrop of personal unrest or personal dissatisfaction. Now, that's not to say that everybody's all hunky-dory and everything's fine. That's just saying that I think the way that people have been socialized to survive in these sorts of places has kind of led them to a certain way of thinking about how to handle issues. That being said, I'm not sure if people are leaving because of racial tensions. I feel like with Arkansas specifically, that a lot of it's just looking for jobs, right? A lot of people are looking for work, and they're not building any new factories or things, or they're not really coming up with creative ways to employ people in these areas. Instead, they're kind of, and I'm saying they as like this omnibus, like big they, but the corporations are buying up a lot of this land, as Sekou mentioned, and they're kind of pushing people out. It's no longer like a small town farmer, as my dad always says. There's nothing left for the little man. That's like, if you're a farmer, then you're either a corporation or you're broke trying to, sell your stuff. So a lot of people are leaving because there's just nothing else for them to do there. And then on the final point, I'll say that the best ways that I found of really getting a message out about something that I've witnessed through these community leaders that I've been in conversation with is honestly asking people who they listen to and going to them and really trying to explain, what you have going on, and not coming to them with, a solution, but coming to them to demonstrate that you're actively willing to work with them to come up with a solution, not coming and telling people, oh, well, y'all need to go to school some more, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. No, you listen to people and see what they've been doing, because the community not gonna listen to you. They don't care who you are, but they will listen to, the grandma that raised everybody on the block, or this lady that's been working so hard to revitalize this old school and bring it back as a community center. They'll listen to those people before they listen to us. So I think that's one of the main ways that I found success in getting into these places where I didn't know anybody, is just, finding people that the community members already respect, and then begging them to help me with my project.
I'll work backwards to Jessica's point about information sharing. Frankly, I think with the Alabama project, we wanted to do a lot more information sharing, and we're still open to doing that. The project was finished actually in May of last year, but the project had to align itself with some of the funders, so it wasn't rolled out until the fall of 2021. Yeah, fall of 2021, and we were hoping to do a rollout at this weekend's Bloody Sunday events, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So the infrastructure for rolling it out and having community meetings, and then things were, frankly, the area was so hard hit by COVID-19 that some of the initial ideas of having in-person meetings and rolling it out were unfortunately, it hurt to roll out. But the Black Belt Community Foundation in particular still sees the Alabama project as fresh and as trying to find ways to roll out. But I think we need to put more infrastructure behind what that means in that particular area. They've even sent their report to I think the local the Congresswoman's office, and I kind of encourage them to see if the report can trigger a hearing with congressional hearings. Talked to Elsie Scott about that about a year and a half ago or so, and she gave me some ideas about how to perhaps trigger that. But we need to do a better rollout, and it's still fairly fresh. In terms of municipal jobs, not many. There's not many municipal jobs. I'm not sure how many are in Selma, or Dallas County, but I would probably think no more than a couple hundred. And then the smaller counties, and then there's the municipal employees, particularly mid-level and more moderate income, they're constantly facing budget cuts, which is really the reason why I think that the municipal living wage thing really garnered even 40-something% among whites, was because there's a vulnerability with the mid-level staff and lower level staff of municipal employees that you kind of see ingredients of it in the paper. I actually looked at housing deeds and so forth in the Dallas County government system. So I went into one of the municipal buildings. Not many people are working there. So we're not talking about the large number of employees. In terms of conversations. I don't know if this is going to get at your answer, but in Alabama, and that part of the Alabama Black Belt, the Western Black Belt, the closure of Craig's Air Force Base in 1977 really just fundamentally changed the entire political economy. I did a separate study. I did 2 studies of Selma and Alabama Black Belt. The other study I did is sequestered. It's for the eyes only of the Selma folks, which I'm hoping to get approval to actually release. It's an economic study that looks at economic elites, transitions in the economy. It's a whole range of factors that I look at, and the closure of Craig's Air Force Base just had such a dramatic impact on the loss of jobs. There's an interesting scene in which Obama goes to visit Selma, and they're tracking him on his way to the Craig's Air Force Base, which is now a hangar. It's just used for flying in people who are, of that status. And they said Obama probably passed by a bunch of closed down buildings, vacant houses, vacant areas. And so there's some disillusion around that, but it's also, I think, a narration of the Alabama Black Belt, although with good intentions, but a narration by The Guardian and national news publications that paints such a dismal picture and such a picture of nihilism that I'm not sure that that's exactly the best, the complete story of those areas. There is a sense of loss among older Black folks who grew up in those areas and are seeing that their properties have been lost. There's joblessness. The Black business community has completely collapsed compared to what it was 60 years ago. And so there is that sense that all of this may be driving people out. I do want to recognize, before going on to, at least, Dara, you did respond to Quentin's question. I do want to recognize Kathy Strohmeyer Golden, and the reason why I want to recognize her, because part of the energy and inspiration for this Black Road Project came out of a Black women's rural project economic study that was done by a consortium of groups across multiple states that I think is the only study of its kind produced. I think it was produced in 2016, and Kathy was a member of that organization. And so, yeah, I do want to recognize the work that Kathy was doing. Any questions or comments?
I have one more thing I'd love to say.
Yeah, we have 7 minutes, so yeah.
It surely won't take that long, but I really want to challenge everyone on this call to expand your mind on what you think it is to be a rural person, or what it means to be in the Black Belt or in the Delta in Arkansas, or whatever that means. So many times people on Twitter, right, they say, throw away the South, or if we could get rid of this part of the country, then, whatever. I don't know what they think would happen if they erased Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama and all these places, except all their cousins and kinfolks and grandmas and grandpas would disappear. So I really want to challenge y'all to consider the ways that we, as academic elites at this point, we're able to kind of forget about these spaces when we move away from them, or we move into big towns and we move up north to Chicago and all this stuff where things are different. But that does not change the fact that there are still people on the ground living their lives, trying to get by, and I don't want us to forget about those folks. And with that, there was a lot, like whenever DT, the ex-president, was elected, a lot of what we heard was this whole forgotten rhetoric, the forgotten people, and they just feel so disrespected. That's why they're voting for this man that's racist and sexist and all these other terrible things, because we need to feel sorry for them. There are a ton of other people who are literally forgotten, right? They didn't get the neighborhood cafe interviews with the New York Times and all that kind of stuff. You know, they didn't get all that. What they have gotten though is their neighbors popping up with more and more Confederate signs and then big Trump 2024 flags flying everywhere. That's what we're dealing with down here. You know, it's not a game. It's not a joke. These are real people who live here. So please, please, please stop saying throw away the South. Stop saying throw us away, because you're throwing away your kinfolk, and that's just not cool.
Ishmael has a question too.
How are you all? Thank you for this panel. It's been really interesting. I kind of came in about halfway through, but having grown up in the South on a farm, I can relate to a lot of this. And so a couple questions, and you know, I think a lot of this is not particularly from, you know, grounded in my sort of what I actually know in terms of research, but mostly from just sort of experience. I heard the panel mention a lot about how, you know, many of these rural areas in the South, particularly Black communities, like where I grew up, have been losing population. And one of the things I observed about my community in particular was the kind of brain loss. Everybody went to college, right? We went to HBCUs, but once we went to HBCUs, we never came back. And many of our parents didn't actually want us to come back, you know, and to the extent that folks did come back, it was to be teachers, in part because there's no jobs there for professionals, right? And so what always sort of interested me about this dynamic was, you know, how do you stop something like that from happening as the Black community, right? In a way that you don't have to rely on white folks to sort of bring jobs and all this to these communities. How do you bring back Black professionals into these towns? You know, because our parents were the first, you know, they went to college, at least in the town I was in. They all went to, those that went to college came back, and they were lawyers, doctors, teachers, but very few of my generation actually came back. But I mean, mostly because there's no jobs in those communities. So I just wanted to get thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I can answer that. I just give you some experiences with the Alabama Black Belt study, because I did two studies there, as mentioned earlier. One is public, one is private, and the impetus behind both actually is driven by an older African-American woman activist who works for Selma, who went to Chicago, went to college, went to Chicago, grew up in Selma, and came back and saw a community 30, 40 years later that looked entirely different, and was just stunned by it. And I mean, there's like stuff that you hear all over, like getting consortium of Black businesses, so to speak, to perhaps come together. But one of the things, I can't really answer your question. Because one of the things that I did in that study that wasn't public, is that I contacted the Alabama Black Chamber of Commerce, and we were trying to identify where are the Black businesses in the Alabama Black Belt. And there's no inventory or list of where they are, or who they are, or where they exist. So there's a resource deficit just in identifying those kinds of Black businesses. I mean, now Selma, they're doing things that they're doing everywhere else. They got opportunity zone there. that's rebuilding downtown. They're using the housing tax credit programs perhaps to help build infrastructure around housing. But it's just not enough to really address, I think, what you're saying, Ishmael. Sorry, I can't answer that question beyond that. Kathy may have an answer, though. Her hand is raised.
Well, I don't know that I have an answer, but just partly. The Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative that you referenced, Sekou, one of the things that, and these are, a lot of these are educated women who are leading these efforts, but it's like they are developing their own businesses and trying to grow community. One has a transportation company here in Mississippi. Another one, they have like a food co-op and stuff.
Yeah.
So they're small scale, but I was just thinking about Ishmael's question, and you got to some of it, but I people like us, like myself and Ishmael, who came from the South in the rural area, I think I sometimes I think, what would happen if we would collectively come together and try to grow some of these places, something similar to Africa Town. They're trying to revive that in Alabama and stuff. So I think, what I've seen is, people are moving back to the South, right? And so for me, that's a potential opportunity for us as community to invest and grow those communities in a way that would serve the people who live there now. It's kind of idealistic, but I think it's possible. And just looking at some of the things that the women with the Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi doing with the Southern Rural Women's Project. So small scale, but it's making a difference.
Yeah, the Southeast Economic Cooperative is doing some really good work around cooperatives. Stuff like that. But
and one of the biggest challenges for us when we were farming was that the county agents would never support us. They wouldn't give us, they were giving the white farmers all manner of, feedback on how to farm, and you should do this and you should do that. We were just on our own figuring it out, like reading some books on farming, because we were we were trying to be a big scale farm. Yeah. I mean, not big scale, like, 100 acres or something, but we were renting, land, and the county agents wouldn't give us any feedback, and tell us what crops we should plant when and how. My dad was reading books and stuff, but he was a sharecropper growing up, and they only grew one thing, cotton. When we try to grow soybeans, in a swamp in South Louisiana, it's not gonna work, right? But nobody was there to help us, and so going forward, farming might be, giving Black farmers feedback and help would be
Yeah, that USDA was infamous for its racism and not supporting Black farmers, and even here in Mississippi, a lot of people's land was taken from them unwittingly. So all that history is there, and I'm not so sure. USDA is doing a bit better, but I'm not convinced that they're doing all that they can and should do. In terms of Black farmers, even here in Mississippi, it's a major issue.
Okay, well, we're going to get cut off, but I will say, Ishmael, for that study that we did, per the request of the Selma folks, they asked about economic, drivers such as using the Career Center in Selma, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the community colleges, partnerships, those kinds of things like that were discussed in the survey. And there was some support for leveraging those kinds of programs. But to your point about brain drain too, is that at least in that part of Alabama Black Belt, Selma College is, if it hasn't collapsed, it's near collapse. There's a community college there that's still, I think, doing pretty well, but yes, to that point, yeah.
I wanted to just jump in really quick because I saw someone in the comments talking about how does Black Rural South compare to the Midwest, and then I just love Ishmael and Kathy's point about the brain drain and economic revitalization. And it made me think about Idlewild and the story that's going on there in Michigan, and how they are really trying to figure out how to make, it was an early tourist destination in the 1900s for Black folks in the Midwest, and, just like celebrities and all that stuff. So it'd be interesting to see kind of if, obviously, like you said, everyone's moving back to the South, but as someone who's living in Atlanta now, I wish I could get away to somewhere in rural something. maybe not where my family's from, which is Arkadelphia, Arkansas, but but I mean, I don't know. I think there, like you all were talking about, there is a lot of potential and possibilities. And so I would love to see how this work in kind of people who live outside of the big cities in the Midwest or in the Northeast. I mean, we don't consider that rural, but just like what their experiences are like being not in these like huge urban metropolitan centers. Because I think, like you said, everyone's thinking about the South, they're thinking Charlotte, Atlanta, Houston, and we're kind of bypassing a whole group of people. So just thank you for doing the work.
If I can close on these two comments, Princess was going to join us. She's probably doing some of the best work comparing blacks from the rural South and the rural Midwest. And she's even doing things like looking at blacks who migrated from the rural South to the urban centers of the South and looking at their experiences. So she's a great person to ask that question, I think, which is important. And I think that's pretty much it. If there's anything else, Dara, any last comments that you have?
No, I'm just honored to be in y'all's presence, with Dr. Stromal Golden and all of y'all asking these questions and giving us these facts and these figures. I appreciate it.
Yeah, there was one comment I was going to make too, also just as a concern for the rural South, is gentrification. And so this is also a concern of potential areas of Black South being now targeted for gentrification the way the urban spaces have been targeted. That's also a concern. Yeah. Well, we appreciate y'all, and thank you for joining this conversation and supporting this at least this early step in looking at Camille Cope's Black rural communities. And thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.